I think that the anticipation of the Fourth Symphony was something that I'd never quite experienced, because I knew Górecki since I was a student. I first met Górecki in 1972 when I was a student in Krakow in southern Poland. I went to visit him, and he was very kind to me, and we got on. And at that time, he was writing his second symphony, although I didn't know that at the time. And I met him over the years, sometimes formally in concerts, but I also stayed with him and his family up in the Tatra Mountains in 1987, where he took me around to meet folk artists, and we met some musicians and so forth. So they sort of embraced me in the family, which is a very special thing, a great honour for me, because I was only 14 years younger than he was. But he felt like a sort of elder brother, father, uncle, grandfather, all those things rolled into one. And I saw him more and more frequently. I stayed with him and his family in the early 1990s when I was writing my book about him, and I saw him warts and all. You know, he wasn't always an easy man. He could be quite demanding. And I remember once when I asked him to see some of his sketches, and he was very private about his private workings. He didn't show them to anybody. And I said, could I look at some of the sketches? He said, no chance. And then after a couple of days, he relented, and he came back from his workshop, which is in another part of the city in Katowice, and said, okay, you can have one. And I said, he said, which one? And I said, I'd like to see the first one, please. So he went back, brought it back that evening, and he said, okay, you can have it until breakfast tomorrow morning. So I had to stay up all night studying this first sketchbook. So that was also a privilege. But he was a man who was full of life. You know, we have this image of him being this recluse who wrote just soft and slow music. Far from it. He was like a cauldron, really. He could bubble over in all sorts of emotions, very dynamic. And his last years were sad in a way. I mean, he was in his 70s, and I last saw him when he was in full health in 2008, when my university had bestowed a fellowship upon him, but he was unable to come to the university, so I went to Zakopane. We had a wonderful ceremony. And then I saw him on his deathbed in Katowice in 2010. At that point, nobody really knew, apart from the family and his publishers, what he had left behind. There were rumours. We knew that the third string quartet, which he'd written in 1995, he had taken 10 years to release. And we heard rumours about other pieces. But we now know that not only was he writing the Fourth Symphony, which he finished in 2006, but he also wrote a number of sacred pieces in the late 1990s. So he wasn't entirely silent. One of the problems in his life in his last 15 years or so was that he had this huge success with the Third Symphony. So when Górecki was being asked to go to Australia and America, and people wanted a piece of him and so on and so forth, it was extraordinary for him, because he had been quite a private man, used to managing his own time and so forth. And suddenly he was at the beck and call of lots of other people. And so that was a little bit disruptive for him. And so some of his pieces he didn't finalise absolutely. And when he died in 2010, we didn't know what was left. As it happens, his son Mikolaj completed the Fourth Symphony almost immediately afterwards. And he did a fantastic job. A really wonderful job. Now, Mikolaj Górecki is also a composer in his own right, a very, very fine composer. But of course he had the special quality of being Henryk Górecki's son. His father had played the music to him on numerous occasions, so he knew what his father's wishes were. And it seems to me that what I hear when I hear the Fourth Symphony, I hear the father. I'm not aware that Mikolaj has been involved. And that was the whole idea, and that's how Mikolaj would want it. What Mikolaj has done with the symphony is to do some orchestration. He hasn't altered the material of the piece. So in musical terms, what Henryk had done was to write a short score, and it's called a short score because it's only on 2 staves, or maybe 3 or 4. It's like a piano score, effectively. And often a composer will put in indications for instrumentation and so on and so forth. But the dynamics are usually there, the speeds are usually there, all the notes are there. And so what Mikolaj had to do was to think, what would my father have done? Now, Anybody trying to second guess their own father actually is quite difficult, and particularly Henryk was quite sort of private about what he did. But there is the music that he'd written before, and so Mikolaj went back to similar pieces like Beatus Vir and the Little Requiem and so forth, and he approximated in the terms of the Fourth Symphony what his father had done in the earlier ones, and it just sounds like authentic Henryk. My involvement in Henryk Górecki's Fourth Symphony is absolutely marginal. I was asked to write the program note. I was asked to write a pre-concert talk for the premiere in April 2014, and I was present for it. But actually it's quite difficult writing about a piece before you've heard it. And at the time I was on a 1,000-mile walk across France, so I had to somehow, with the score, without a piano, try to work out what to say about this piece. And immediately when I looked at it, I thought, this is a very strange animal. Okay, it has 4 movements, which sort of match the normal 4 movements of a symphony. You've got a first movement, you've got a slower second movement, you've got a scherzo with a trio as a third movement, and you've got a finale. So that was clear, and it was obviously going to last about 30 minutes. But this was a Górecki that I half recognised but didn't fully recognise. So I wrote the program note, and I went to the rehearsals. Now that was a really wonderful thing to go to all the rehearsals from the very beginning in the week of the premiere, and talk to the conductor. We talked about some of the quotations that Henryk uses and other people's music that he refers to. But even then, I didn't know how it was all going to hang together, because in rehearsal you don't necessarily hear the whole piece from A to Z. You don't hear the whole piece from start to finish. And so it was only in the concert that I was on tenterhooks, because I really didn't know how it was going to work, because it was so full of contrasts. We knew that it wasn't going to be like Henryk Górecki's Third Symphony, the famous Symphony of Sorrowful Songs, which he'd written in 1976, so 30 years earlier. And that's what the public knows. That's what he's famous for. So we knew, and I made sure that my notes said, this is not the Third Symphony. But nobody needed to have worried. The reception was absolutely mind-blowing. I mean, you could have heard a pin drop for the 30 minutes. And then when it finished, the audience was on its feet. I was astonished. I mean, I was on my feet as well, but I'm kind of biased. But this is an audience that had come, a full house had come, and the reception was fantastic. I think those listeners for whom the only Górecki with which they're familiar is the Third Symphony, and there are millions of those, they might be wondering, the Fourth Symphony, is it going to be the same? Well, it definitely is not the same. And the Third Symphony, in a way, is an anomaly in Henryk Górecki's music. I mean, it's 55 minutes of slow music. There are one or two other pieces which come close. But there was this other side to Henryk Górecki. If you take the harpsichord concerto, which is included in the box set that's being issued, that is 9 minutes, 2 movements, extremely fast, extremely bubbly, extremely vital. And Henryk was both of these things. And what you get in the Fourth Symphony is both of those things. So you have the finale, which is almost like circus music. The scherzo on the outer sections, those are also quite lively. The first movement is very imposing, but the second movement and the trio are very intimate, very almost internalized. That is closer, I suppose, to the more familiar pieces like the Third Symphony. But what you get in this Fourth Symphony, I think, is pretty much the widest range of Henryk's character, because the man makes the music, and whatever style Henryk was writing in, from the earlier days when it was extremely avant-garde to the last days when it could be very reflective, it was still Henryk. It was still very intense. It was of the earth, but it was also of the mind and of the spirit. He was a very spiritual man. I'd rather say he was spiritual than religious, but he was, he was a strong believer in the Roman Catholic Church and so forth. But I think he had very broad interests in terms of what constitutes the mind, what constitutes the spirit, what constitutes the soul. And that can involve earthy things as well as ethereal things. And this is what you get in the Fourth Symphony. In everybody's life, there are moments which you cannot predict, but which have been fundamental to you as a person and how your life develops. And Henryk Górecki was one of those moments. We were very unlike in terms of personality, but somehow we bonded. And I became a member of their family, and I still am with the surviving members of the family. So I have written about Górecki on many occasions. I wrote my little book about him in the mid-1990s. And so it was a great honour for me to be involved in this premiere, first of all by looking at the score and trying to decipher it. When I was walking through France with not a piano in sight, and in my backpack there was my score of Henryk Górecki's Fourth Symphony, and I was trying to decipher it. I'm a musician, so I can read music, but that doesn't necessarily mean you can hear it all. And so when I came to London, I broke my walk for a few days to come to London to go to the rehearsals, and suddenly it came alive. And seriously, it came alive. I thought, wow, this is some piece. And it was a thrill to get up on the Royal Festival Hall stage and give a half-hour introduction to Henryk and his background and this particular symphony. But I still had not heard the piece all the way through. So that was a great honour and a great thrill. But it wasn't over for me then. I mean, I went back to France the next day. I got the train to Paris and I went down to Limoges and restarted my walk. And for the next week, the first theme of the Fourth Symphony was going round and round in my head. I could not get rid of it. I was very happy because, it was by Henryk. But to give you an indication of what a big impact this performance had had, I was phoned up a couple of days into my walk by a local radio station in Northern Ireland saying, would I give, because it was just before Easter, would I give a radio interview for their classical music programme about the Fourth Symphony. So we arranged that they would phone me at a certain time where I knew I'd be off a main road. I just got off the main road, 100 metres, phone rings. There I am in the middle of the French countryside, talking to somebody in Belfast, Northern Ireland, about Górecki's Fourth Symphony. It was done, it was then broadcast. Meantime, I'd gone on my walk. And I love that sort of coincidence that a piece of music can have an impact anywhere. And I wasn't expecting to have this earworm in my head, which eventually faded, of course, but it shows the strength of the material, actually, that Henryk has put into this Fourth Symphony.